In this video, we're going to be looking at muscles that move the elbow, wrist, and fingers. So the learning objectives are much like they were for the shoulder. Let's learn which muscles move the elbow, wrist, and fingers in the sagittal plane, in the coronal plane, as well as the transverse plane. So we're going to start off looking at this, and here you can also already pick out some muscles that we've already seen, right? There's the pectoralis major, there's the serratus anterior, sternocleidomastoid. This is actually part of the trapezius, and there's the deltoid. Coracobrachialis is tucked barely right underneath there. Triceps you can kind of see from back here. You'd get a better view from the back. This guy here is the biceps brachii. So the biceps brachii we covered last time. It flexes the elbow, flexes the shoulder, also does some supination of the elbow. So triceps brachii extends the elbow and extends the shoulder. There's a better look at the triceps brachii. So this is one part of it. There's another part, and the other part is tucked inside, which is why it's called the triceps for three heads. Triceps brachii is this guy over here. So again, what does he do? He's going to extend the elbow and he's going to extend the shoulder. Brachialis is buried right underneath the biceps brachii, so we'd actually have to dig underneath to get a better look at him. So this is the biceps brachii. If you were to dig deeper, then underneath there would be the brachialis muscle. So if we were to peel away the biceps brachii, then right underneath there, this guy here is the brachialis muscle, and this is with the biceps brachii removed. This is the coracobrachialis. Okay. Brachialis, again, tucked underneath there, what he does is simply flex the elbow. That's all. Brachioradialis is this fellow right over here, and I think we're going to get another look at him in some of the other slides. This guy right over here is the brachioradialis. So brachioradialis is going to flex the elbow, but he does so best when your body is in a thumbs up position. Okay, we've covered this one. Oh, there's another look at the brachialis muscle buried underneath. And again, there was coracobrachialis again. So looking at the backside, again, we've covered these in the previous videos: supraspinatus, infraspinatus, teres minor, all of which are part of the rotator cuff. And this guy here is the teres major. And then here's the triceps, which we just talked about. And this guy here is Latissimus Dorsi. We also mentioned him before. So he does adduction of the shoulder as well as internal rotation. So adduction. So this is the muscle if you're doing the so-called lat pulls or a pull-up motion. That's what he's going to do. So teres major, internal rotation of the shoulder, as well as adduction of the shoulder. And I think those are a review from another video. Okay, so again, elbow extensors. We looked at the triceps already, and there's one more that's been cut off a bit, and this guy here it's not cut off. You just can't see it all the way. It's Anconeus. So Anconeus is another elbow extensor. If we slide over to our study guide, so there's the elbow. So now you've learned biceps brachii, brachialis, brachioradialis, and now these next set of muscles right over here are all muscles that actually end up flexing the wrist. But what we'll see is that even though they all end up moving the wrist, they actually do a little bit of elbow flexion. The extensors then here are on the back, the triceps brachii, a little typo right there, that's the triceps brachii, as well as the Anconeus. And then in the elbow, the last movements we have, so you'll see in the elbow, we don't have abduction and adduction. Those movements just don't exist at the elbow. And so what we have, though, and again, we don't have internal, external rotation. What we do have, though, are supination and pronation. So if we look at the names, biceps brachii, we already know, and he does supination. There's another muscle called supinator, which we'll have to point out. And then pronation, there's only two muscles that are going to do that, pronator teres and pronator quadratus. I mean, the function is written right into the name itself. So let's look for some of these guys. So when we look here, this guy right over here is the supinator muscle. And what does he do? He supinates the elbow. And then this guy right over here is the pronator teres, and down below is here, and that is pronator quadratus. So those are all the muscles then, coming back to our study guide, those are all the muscles that end up flexing, extending, supinating, pronating the elbow. So now this muscle group, as I said, these are the ones that actually act primarily at the wrist. Let's look at those. And you'll see it's a repeat here, right? Well, pronator teres we see over here, but then the rest of them, flexor carpi radialis, flexor carpi radialis, flexor carpi ulnaris, flexor carpi ulnaris, palmaris longus, flexor digitorum superficialis, flexor Digitorum superficialis. So all these muscles, what are they going to do? They're all going to flex the wrist. I know I got to show you a picture of them, but I just want you to see that all these guys flex the wrist. And they also do just a little bit of elbow flexion. So let's look at them. Here they are right there, the wrist flexors. When we look at the wrist flexors, we have Flexor Carpi Radialis, Palmaris longus, and Flexor Carpi Ulnaris. They're lined up right here in a row. And if you see coming down here, you'll see the tendons of each of these guys coming out. Wherever you are right now, if you flex your wrist and give a little bit of resistance so that the tendons really pop out, then most of you will have a Flexor Carpi Radialis and a Flexor Carpi Ulnaris tendon that pops out. Many of you will have a Palmaris longus, but Palmaris longus is one of these weird muscles where in a certain percentage of people, they don't have a Palmaris longus. So some of you, when you flex your wrist, you're only going to see these two tendons, and some of you will see 1, 2, and 3. You'll see all 3 tendons. So those are all the wrist flexors. So in this slide, we've covered the wrist flexors. We looked at pronators and supinators. You already know triceps brachii is an elbow extensor, and we already know the elbow flexors. So what we need to look at now then are wrist extensors. So looking at the wrist extensors, the name says it itself: Extensor Carpi Ulnaris, Extensor Carpi Radialis Longus, Extensor Carpi Radialis Brevis. And you see them clearly labeled here: Extensor Carpi Ulnaris, Carpi Radialis Longus, Extensor Carpi Radialis Brevis. So all those things are listed out. Back to our study guide here then. Oops. All right, let's go back here. What do we see? We see we got all the wrist flexor muscles. The only one that's missing so far are these two, actually, Flexor Digitorum Superficialis and Profundus, but we've covered the rest of these guys, except for Extensor Digitorum and Digiti Minimi. So let's look at these. Flexor Digitorum Superficialis, Flexor Digitorum Profundus. What do you think those muscles do? What those muscles do primarily is that they flex the fingers. So you'll see that they flex the fingers. They just happen to also flex the wrist. Extensor Digitorum, Extensor Digiti Minimi, what do those do? Well, they extend the fingers. They also happen to influence the wrist. So as you can see, we've got some muscles out there that move 2 joints, proximal and distal joints. Our earliest introduction was the Biceps Brachii that flexed the elbow as well as flexed the shoulder proximally. So let's find some of those finger muscles. So when we zoom down here, we've got a bunch here. Brachioradialis, we already talked about, flexes the elbow in a thumbs up position. Here's that Flexor Carpi Ulnaris, Palmaris longus, Flexor Carpi Radialis all over again. We just saw those here in this slide, and we're seeing them again here just from a different book. Flexor Pollicis longus flexes the thumb. That's this guy over here, and he'll end up moving the thumb. And now we can start to see the finger flexors. Flexor Digitorum Superficialis is this guy right over here. And if you follow him, you'll look at his tendons and watch them go all the way through, and they come all the way down through here. I've labeled the tendon of Flexor Digitorum Superficialis. That goes out here and attaches to the middle phalanx. Because it attaches to the middle phalanx, it will flex the proximal interphalangeal joint. So we consider that with his synergistic muscle, which is Flexor Digitorum Profundus. So again, what's the difference? One is superficial, right over here. If you were to peel him back, you'll see Flexor Digitorum Profundus, which is this guy over here. And his tendons come down, and when you follow his tendon straight through, you'll see he actually attaches to the distal phalanx. And because he attaches to the distal phalanx, he actually he flexes the distal interphalangeal joint. So Flexor Digitorum Superficialis flexes the proximal interphalangeal joint. Flexor Digitorum Profundus will flex the distal interphalangeal joint. While we're here, there's a better look at Flexor Pollicis longus. We saw him earlier on this slide, Flexor Pollicis longus. Remember, we saw him tucked in there. But if we peel some stuff away, we get a better view of him right over Flexor Pollicis longus. So you see his muscle belly is there. His tendon wraps through, comes right through, and attaches right there to the thumb. Pronator quadratus we saw. What's a synergistic muscle to pronator quadratus? You should have come up with pronator teres. And there's a better look at supinator that we saw earlier as well. All right. From the posterior view, this is the posterior aspect of the forearm. We see a bunch of muscles here. Extensor Carpi Ulnaris, Extensor digitorum. So extensor carpi ulnaris, he extends the wrist and also does ulnar deviation. In that YouTube video, the first one that I posted, it shows you ulnar and radial deviation. And then extensor digitorum, it extends digits 2 to 5. And if you follow this guy through and watch his tendons, you'll see that he goes to the index, middle, ring, and pinkies, digits 2, 3, 4, and 5, but he doesn't actually go off to the thumb. So what you'll note here is that the thumb is special. He gets its own set of muscles. Right over here, extensor digiti minimi extends the pinky. So this guy comes through and he comes right up to the pinky or the 5th digit. Other muscles you'll see here are extensor carpi radialis brevis, which also extends the wrist, and extensor carpi radialis longus, who comes down and he also goes off to here and extends the wrist. Abductor pollicis longus will create abduction of the thumb. So again, what I want you to note here is many times the name says it abducts the pollex, extends the digits, extends the wrist and lives on the radial side and is short, extends the wrist, lives on the radial side and is longer, extends the wrist and lives on the ulnar side of the forearm. So in many cases, the name of the muscle is going to tell you what it does. Extensor pollicis brevis, what does he do? He extends the thumb, and he's a shorter muscle. So we come on down then, and the last slide here for the upper extremity, we see extensor pollicis longus a little bit more clearly after we've peeled some stuff away. Extensor indicis, the index finger, also gets his own extensor. Who's a synergistic muscle to him? Well, we saw a moment ago, extensor digitorum is synergistic because he also goes off and extends the index finger. We see extensor pollicis brevis. Who's a synergistic muscle to him? Well, in other words, who also extends the thumb? Extensor pollicis longus also extends the thumb. And then abductor pollicis longus abducts. We saw him a moment ago. There's abductor pollicis longus kind of tucked underneath. If we are to peel some of these muscles away, that's when we see abductor pollicis longus a little bit more clearly. And then there's one more view of Anconeus as well as supinator. So where we're at, if you go back to our study guide here, then we've covered all these muscles here. We've covered all the wrist muscles as well. And then finally we got here down into the finger muscles. So I know there's a lot there, and we went through quickly because you can play the videos over and over. Again, look at your book for sure to find these different muscles. And make sure you understand these functions. So that'll wrap up the upper extremity muscles.